Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a series of conversations on the topic of designing better miniature games. My name is Mike Hutchinson. I have designed such miniature games as Gaslands and A Billion Suns and the recently kickstarted Hobgoblin. Glenn Ford is also a games designer, and he has designed many fine games. Indeed, he has some miniature games on their way to production as we speak. He, of course, worked with together with me on Gaslands and A Billion Suns and other things. The topic that I would like to discuss, because it came up in a random thought bubble in a previous episode, and then we got chewing on it a little bit in the Discord, was the feeling of eek halfway through my game design process. Something seems to be changing. Is this something I should resist against, or is this something that I should just go with the flow on? And specifically, we talked initially about, like, when I'm designing a game, should I change the theme when I realize that this is maybe a better cowboy game than it was a, barroom brawl game? But I think that also, and perhaps more realistically, based on the examples I've got from my own work, like, when is a game that you thought was one kind of game allowed to mutate into a different kind of game, which might be a better expression of what you had as an idea initially? And then I think the third thing that we can also tickle the underbelly of is, what if you have a wonderful game mechanical idea and it ends up just not being a spaceship mechanic and you have to go and use it somewhere else? So should we do a couple of examples and use those as springboards?
Sure. So I think I'd say quickly, as a sort of an overarching idea, I feel like there's sort of three parts to this thing, and it's interesting you said theme there, because we do have a video about whether
Yeah, I meant
theme and setting are the same. Yeah, and I do think it's thing. I think there is the idea, the theme, the big thing for your game, and that might be the thing that can't change, and it can be the setting, it can be a mechanic, it can be something else entirely. It can be like, I want to make people laugh halfway through the game, I want to make it feel like this is a gunfight, I want to make somebody afraid, I want to recreate a certain movie, I want to make a mechanic with string work, whatever it happens to be. That's the idea. And my personal opinion is, you can't move away from that. Everything else, and the main two things that you might want to fudge around with, are the mechanics and the setting. And I feel like those things can change, because I think that a lot of the time, I think that game design is more of a process of discovery than you might suspect. That you've got like you say, you've got an interesting mechanic, and you start twiddling with it. You think, oh, this is going to be a spacecraft thing. And you go, oh, just a minute. It's a boat. It's not a spacecraft, or it's a guy ice skating. But yeah, I mean, we can sort of reference some examples from our own design. I think you were saying before we came on that in relation to A Billion Suns, that
yeah, definitely. So, like, A Billion Suns, like, it came out, I watched some of the newer Star Wars movies whenever it was, like Rogue One and the one that the mainline story around the same time, and I was deeply inspired by the cinematography of the starship fight, of the like massive spaceship fights. And I bloody love spaceship fights, and I've loved them in cinema forever, and I've played lots of games with them in. And the most recent game I'd been playing was Star Wars Armada, which just hadn't tickled my, like, it hadn't clicked for me. It didn't do the things that I wanted spaceships to do. And I was looking around and I was thinking, do you know what? There's not that many modern spaceship games that have been recently released. And this looks like an interesting spot. And so I pitched it to Osprey with really a shell of an idea. But it was an idea that contained the combat system, which survived till the very last. Like, I thought the most interesting thing about this is how big ships and small ships, big guns and small guns, all interact in really interesting ways. And that's cool. And that survives till the end. But it wasn't actually the idea. The idea was that image that I talked about a bunch of times, where there's a Corvette trying to escape, and it's got a clear run out of the planet's orbit, and then a Star Destroyer just like warps in right next to it, and it smashes into it and crashes. And, like, there's no game that can do that. And so the game mechanics that I was developing had to encounter that. But genuinely, at the beginning of the game design process, I thought I was making a Battlefleet Gothic, Star Wars Armada, rack them up, crash them in the middle. I've just got a really cool resolution system. And as I tried to figure out how to make that central image work, that's how we got to the teleporting in ships and the buying in ships, and the buying in ships led to the victory points being a currency, and the weirdness of that led to the multiple tables. And so I guess at some point I had to decide, am I heading off with a game idea that is in service of that central image, or am I okay with this abandoning the sort of battleships in space thing, or am I going to have to say no, the kind of game that I was trying to deliver was a more normal rack it up, fight it out game. And it was an interesting game design question that I still don't have the maturity to know like what the right answer is. And I know it's a difficult decision because lots of people still bounce off the game going, well, this isn't like, this says it's a Starship Battles game and it just isn't. What the hell, Osprey?
Yeah, and I think the thing I think that was interesting was that, and we had this conversation a few times in the middle of development, is that for it to be the rack 'em up and fight spaceship game, the combat resolution system itself needed to have more of a crunchiness in the relationship, I think, between angles and firing angles and maneuvering and all those sorts of things. And you fundamentally you wanted the maneuvering particularly to be very abstract, and the shooting to be quite abstract. It's like, okay, I couldn't see, and I don't know that there is a way to squeeze enough like juice out of very abstract movement, very abstract shooting, the resolution system, and a pitch battle game. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that was, you were interested in this idea of like ships jumping right into the battle, and that's where jump shock is still sort of hanging around as a physical resolution of that idea. And what it ended up being is like, well, why is it interesting like that the Empire can jump this Star Destroyer or whatever it is right into the middle of the battle and dump on a Corvette? And it's like, well, it's interesting because the Empire has a presence off of this battlefield of a certain size and a certain weight and a certain power, and that gives like a weight to the relationship of what life is like being a rebel Corvette and escaping a battlefield or a combat zone that is relevant and interesting. And the only way of making that happen is to make the game itself more epic, turn it into a space opera on the tabletop, have relationships off the table. And so Billion Suns became sort of the thing that it ended up being.
Yeah, and I yes, and it was a difficult decision moment where like, am I changing? And I think I might be using the word theme more correctly here. Am I changing the theme of A Billion Suns in the middle of it from a battle game to this more space opera-y type theme? And then the other one that I've been working on more recently is, and I'll just ramble for a little minute here because there's a couple of kinds of twist in the work in a Pacific Command. So Pacific Command has had a similarly rocky development cycle in that Pacific Command started as a weekend sort of game hack where I took A Billion Suns and I turned it into a World War II naval game. And it was fine, and we played it once and you were totally disinterested by it for good reason. Like, it did the thing, but it was just an utterly perfunctory naval war game. And so I took a deep look at what was exciting to me about the potential for making like a World War II naval game. And my mind first went to sub hunting, which is its own sort of fog of war niche. But then I sort of became more and more interested by the fog of war that is like, you don't have radar and you don't really know where the enemy ships are. And the most extreme example of that, the most like narratively over dramatic and overblown, is the Pacific conflict. And so then I realized, okay, well, I'm definitely making a game about boats, but it's more about the fog of war than anything else. And I know that I want to solve because I think early on you were like, it's really hard to solve double blind problems. So, good luck with that. And I was like, right, okay, right. And so solving double blind and doing a fog of war system became like everything has to be in service of that. And so the game sort of sharply veered. And then it became even more bizarre because in trying to design the system, the only way that I could truly get my hands around the design problem was to temporarily like bamboozle myself and rewire myself into saying, okay, I am designing a stealth mech game where we're on a battlefield. All of the mechs have got advanced jamming systems. Like, the high-tech super radar doesn't work. How would these mechs behave, and how would they shoot each other? And in order to get the combat system working, I had to think as if, a group of like 16 destroyers with 3 carriers and a battleship was like a single fighting engine. And so I actually started writing a mech game in order to sort of explore that and then bring the learnings back to Pacific Command. So it's not that Pacific Command changed its theme into a mech game. Like, it didn't change its setting and its sort of chrome, but like under the hood, something bizarre happened. And although it's still extremely informed by all the research that I'm doing into the history of the period, at its heart, it's like a stealth mech game.
So I think if there is a sort of game design lesson there, is that sometimes the thing you think is interesting you about the thing that you think your game is actually turns out to not be the thing that you think is interesting you. Like that you're saying, like, you were interested in fleet battles at sea, and you thought it was this thing to do with like big battleships. I mean, I remember.
Well, no, I think more clearly actually stated it is. I thought the interesting thing was, wouldn't it be interesting to re-theme A Billion Suns and get some further gameplay out of it? And then I discovered in trying to do that no, actually, that wasn't as interesting to me as something else. And so maybe for me, actually, maybe this is an example where the idea actually mutated and I found a better idea and I threw the old idea away completely. And then I was like, oh no, now I have the idea. Like I was sort of, maybe I was on the journey to something, but I was only tantalizingly sort of smelling it. And then I found it. And I was like, oh yeah, wow, like stealth mech game, amazing.
Yeah, you got contracted to write a fleet battle naval game, found out the first idea you had was terrible, and came up with something that would be a good game.
That's right. Although, like, one of the things that gives me boldness here is that, like, Warlord games are like, they already print the rulebook for Victory at Sea.
Mm.
So if I was to deliver a Victory at Sea clone, like, it's not only a waste of my time, it's also kind of like uncool for Warlord. Like, I don't want to play in their paddling pool because they've already got a game they're selling miniatures for, they've got a business, they've got employees, got pensions to pay.
And
But like, that gives me design space, which is not Victory at Sea. And you know what? There's loads of design space in not Victory at Sea.
and I think it's like relating back to our previous conversation about, does the world need your game? And that moment of going like, just a minute, this exists. And a
Right.
really good version of this exists. I'd best do something entirely different then.
Right. And so that's, I think, to link that back to like holding yourself to a higher standard, an earlier video as well. Like, I got to that point and was like, does the world need this game? No, I want to do better than this. I feel like there is a better game. There's more interesting, novel challenges to attack with this. And so I guess the last point I want to make on this is, for me, like, changing the theme of A Billion Suns, or even reusing some of the mechanical ideas from Pacific Command to create a different kind of battle game in a science fiction universe, for example. Like, these are things that during the development and long after, I get really interested by, but I don't think they can ever truly distract me from like wanting to make the idea that I've got in my head work. And I suppose, like you were saying, if the idea is, well, I want to solve a particular design challenge, or I want to deliver a kind of emotional hit or a kind of cinematic hit, then I think it is definitely feasible to say, wait, I thought this was a science fiction game, but actually it's like a modern game, or some drift. I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't had an example of something that like completely mutates its setting
I
in
mean,
such a strong way, but I don't know why it isn't
I have a game like, sitting in the background somewhere, which I wrote originally to be so a guy I knew was giving up his friendly local gaming store business
Hmm.
to print a skirmish game of his own, like in his retirement, and he decided to make it a Hammer horror sort of themed game. And I looked at it, and this was before I started sort of seriously looking into game design, and it was garbage. Not in a horrible way. It was just like, oh, this is fine, but it's a normal skirmish game, and someone's put on a Dracula hat, and I'm like, oh, I'm Dracula. And I was like, okay, well, if I was gonna, and just for my own amusement, if I was gonna make a Hammer horror game, what would I want to do? And it's like, okay, well, the thing about Hammer Horror is, why doesn't Dracula fly in like in the first 5 minutes and pull off Van Helsing's head? Because Van Helsing needs prep time. He's Batman. Dracula doesn't. Right. Well, there we go. Movie over in 5 minutes. I developed this system where like you have to build up, and everybody has to build up their powers, and it's the same in turn. It's like, why is it always the last human in the horror film who ends up killing the bad guy? It's always
Hmm.
the last girl, it's always the last survivor. And it's like, okay, well, the reason for that is that humans build up their power points by dying, and whoever the last person is who is alive, they're going to be awesome, whoever they happen to be. Ideally, you'd like it to be Van Helsing because he's got some juice to like power this stuff out. But if it's the blacksmith, he's going to be okay. And the reason that Dracula doesn't just fly in is that he needs his underlings to like start pulling up power, but they have to throw it back to Dracula because he's their boss, and so they have a more hierarchical thing. And okay, well, this explains why the plot of those sorts of movies happen. And I thought, I watching an anime the other day, and the guy in the anime is just getting battered, absolutely beaten, destroyed, and then just before he's about to be destroyed, he does his like Uber thing and completely obliterates the other guy. The guy is just dusted instantaneously. It's like, well, why don't you just walk in on like
Do
step
that.
one, go, there we go, that was an easy job, and go away again. You can't do that. You've got to wait until you've been
Yeah, you're not
absolutely,
cross enough.
almost killed. And it's also when Hulk Hogan hulks up, why does he not hulk up in the dressing room and then destroy everybody in the wrestling ring? Because that's not narratively interesting. But why would you not do it in a game if you had that capacity? And it's like, having built that system, it's like, oh, right. Well, this works for a whole bunch of things because a whole bunch of movies do this same, like, well, the reason he didn't do it because it was narratively not interesting for him to do it. Well, I can't do that. I need to explain it, and that's like a system I built for a very, very specific narrative reason. That's like, all right, this kind of works for everything now. I could retheme this in like 20 different ways.
Mm.
And it's not because it wasn't designed very narratively, but it's because movies and cinema use the same tropes like over and over and over.
Mm.
Um, and I think, just to sort of finish out on, possibly get close to finishing out on a thing I think is an interesting idea, is like, we've talked before on the channel about a game called Skulljacker that I
Mm.
unceremoniously killed for Mike. And one of the ideas that was in Skulljacker
Dropped a psychic nuke on it.
is psychologically ruined
You
him.
could go back and watch the post mortem that we did on this channel
Yeah.
some
Um,
years ago.
and the thing about Skulljacker that I most like want to go back to is there was
Mm.
the idea that there was like a crowd control thing where your operatives were moving through like occupied cities doing like black ops stuff, and like the crowds would react to you firing a gun, and then we were like, okay, can I fire a gun like into the pavement to like shove the crowds over to that guy? And oh, that's interesting. And we
Mm.
never really got to that. And since then, a few times we've sort of said, okay, well, that's like, I don't know, Bond or Born Supremacy or something like that, where the secret agent is trying to get through a train station, and or if you get the people to get in his way, or you clear the crowd, so he's the only guy. If like you fire a gun in the crowd and all the normal civilians run, and he's standing there like, "Why not running? Because I'm not afraid of guns." It's like, well, that's a bit of a giveaway. Does he have to go with the crowds? And
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. And at the time, we discussed like a retheme for Assassin's Creed
mm,
2, I think, with the one in Italy, where it's like you can hug crowds and you can use the crowds as like you can sort of silverfish along with them and then jump out to do an assassinate. And like mechanically, like the idea of like for sort of cyberpunk agents hiding in a futuristic city, or born in a modern day train station, or like, yeah,
And I
they're all
think
using the
that's
same mechanical idea for the same thematic and narrative
yeah.
purpose.
And I think that's an interesting thing because that mechanic was quite a peripheral mechanic. It was kind of like a scaffolding thing around this other game that was Skulljacker, and it's sort of like, well, that wasn't a scaffold. That's a spine of a game. That's a
Mm.
central thing of a game. And figuring out which of the sometimes you think a thing is like the spine, and you realize that like this is the game, and that's that you can just take that off. It was scaffolding all along. And sometimes the thing that you think is just holding up the real game is the real game. And like trying to identify that and knowing what to go in service of. Again, I think it's the thing that where it's really important to have a good, strong like design document or design idea that lays out what the ideas are. I mean, I think, and in reference to one of the things we said before, like, design for yourself, or I design for myself, is that I think sometimes that like designing for a constituency of one, it's very easy to lose sight of the idea, the thing, because you keep putting in things you like. And the thing is, it's like I've said, I mentioned this analogy before once or twice. I like chocolate cake and I like steak. Therefore, a meal that I like doesn't have everything that I like to eat in it because I don't want gravy and chocolate sauce in the same mouthful. You know, a well-designed game is one thing. It's not 100 things. And if you
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
stuff in,
100%.
it's going to be 100 good things, and that's not the same as it being one good thing.
The other thing about designing for one is that when you show it to another human and they go, "Oh yeah, 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 I like this. You should, put more chocolate sauce on this," and be like, "No, this is a steak dinner. The chocolate sauce is not good for it." So like when I'm showing a design in an early playtest and people start throwing ideas at me, like that's actually a really exciting moment where I first test my like design armor and be like, oh crap, I don't know if your idea makes sense or not because I actually don't know what the game's about yet. That's a problem. Versus like, yeah, I can confidently sort of thank you for that idea and throw it away, or like welcome it with open arms and say, yes, that's exactly the sort of thing that I want to think more about. Um,
And that's interesting because it's like that's such a hard thing to do. And I think we were so lucky that the first sort of big thing, was Gaslands, because it came in with its own like personality to such a degree that it was relatively easy to find. I think if the first thing had
I
been
think I instinctively, or I rather unconsciously, had a very clear vision for what that game should feel like on the table. I can't tell you exactly like what the roots of that feeling were, but like they go very, very deep back into my childhood. So I'm very confident and firm about them. Whereas with A Billion Suns, like I because I think partly because it was my second album, and partly because it was a more complicated idea. It was a more novel idea. Like it just took me a long time to figure that one out. Um, and I think that I was just lucky with Gaslands in that regard. And sort of Skulljacker kind of proves that because I didn't actually have the maturity to really identify in Gaslands what about the core premise I was shooting for. And with Skulljacker, I just threw a bunch of things together. And when you came and like put a load of other stuff on top of it, I was like, I'm lost. I just don't know I don't know where the idea is anymore because I didn't know what it was strongly enough at first.
Yeah. So I mean, to sort of wrap up on this, a good, strong design document is a very good idea. I think, particularly if you're like a lone designer, because it can be something you can refer back to and you can hang in big letters on the wall and go and it tell you again what it was meant to be. I think should you change your setting and mechanics halfway through a game? I think yeah, sure.
Oh, mechanics, yeah. Like I've
Yeah,
changed my mechanics like a dozen times a week during playtesting.
however central you think they are in service of whatever the idea is.
Mm.
Figure out what the idea is, and if something, even if you love a mechanic or love a setting and it's not in service of the idea, dump it, just bin it off, write it down somewhere. It could work for something else, but it's wrong for this thing. Not every good thing
Stick it
is
in your
right.
Jason Bourne game.
Exactly, absolutely. um Yeah, and if the idea does have to mutate, maybe you weren't clear on it, then it can happen. I think, save the document before you mutate it and move on to another version, and be ready to go back if needs be, and talk to other people. Sometimes they have a better idea of what your game actually is than you, and let your game try and tell you what it is. Sometimes it is a process of discovery rather than a process of like engineering and manufacture.
Oh, I've got another example actually. Before you go, I
Okay.
wrote we were playing Manor War, so I thought, oh, I wonder if I can write a Age of Sail game using Gaslands templates. And then I had some plastic tanks on my desk, and so I drilled a hole, put a cocktail stick, and made some sails for some tanks, and thus the unreleased Gaslands spin-off Rad Pirates of the Toxic Sea was born, which will see the light of day at some point. But the wind mechanic is really good.
If you would like to see Rad Pirates of the Toxic Sea released as a full game, please go down to the comments section, explain to us why and what you think the win mechanic
And
is.
join my Patreon. That's not going to just happen. Actually, it might.
Um, if you're watching this channel, there's a good chance you're designing your own game. There's a good chance that it's become something you thought it wasn't, or you had to drop something or kill one of your darlings in its development. Tell us that story in the comments section. While you're down there, hit likes and subscribes like a mad person, and then swing by the Discord. This conversation was partly off of a chat we are having in the Discord about this idea that somebody in the Discord is experiencing this sort of process at the moment. So you're not alone if this is happening to you. Come by. There's a whole group of people who've had it happen to them multiple times, and in some
Mm.
cases over a range of years. But for now, I think this is going to be a thank you and goodbye for this episode of Rule of Carnage. So I'll say thank you and goodbye.
Bye bye.
Bye 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 bye.